When I asked why he had issued a family card for his relatives, Stephen threw his head back and laughed, as if he had heard something obvious, as if the reason was so simple that it did not even require explanation. "Well, of course it's because they're my family," he said with confidence. There was lightness in his voice and perhaps a hint of reproach. "Of course, they should have a family card, shouldn't they?" he added, and I felt his calm confidence envelop the room. There was something cocky in his tone that made me wary. Noticing my surprise, Stephen continued, no longer laughing, but still with the same shade of complacency. "Do you have a problem with that?" He sighed and, looking me straight in the eye, said, "If you knew who took you in when you were all alone, you wouldn't have said such things. You would understand." This unexpected turn in the conversation took me by surprise. I didn't expect such a direct tone from Stephen, who had seemed much softer and more restrained to me before. "If you're really grateful for everything, then you should do more for my family," he continued, and his words seemed to hang in the air, accumulating a heaviness that I felt with every cell of my body. "Then I can consider you part of the family. But for now, it's like you're on probation." Probation period? I had never heard such an expression in the context of marriage, and it surprised me even more. Stephen gave me a piercing look, as if testing me. "Do you understand? If you don't like it, you can leave at any time. So far, our family is only 6 people." Those words burned me, and I felt numb. Something broke in my head. The idea that I was on probation in my own marriage was so absurd that it seemed like a ridiculous dream. A wave of bewilderment swept over me, and then anger. As soon as Stephen stopped talking, I immediately made a decision, canceled all our joint credit cards and moved out of our shared house. My name is Olivia Cook, I'm 30 years old. I work as a freelancer and illustrator. I used to be a designer at a large advertising agency, but 5 years ago, after getting married, I decided to leave and start working on my own. Now I work from home, which seemed to me a convenient choice at that time. My parents died when I was still a child. They died in an accident, and since then I have been raised by my maternal grandparents. After they left, I returned to my parents' apartment, near the city center, to study at college, and I've been living there ever since. It was during this period that I met Stephen. We met at an Italian restaurant where he worked as a waiter. It was a cozy place with good cuisine and affordable prices. My colleagues and I often went there. Stephen immediately attracted attention, tall, confident, with a pleasant smile and manners. I noticed how many visitors came specifically to see him again. I can't deny that I soon became one of his fans myself. Stephen stood out from the others. There was something special about him, something that caught and did not let you look away. It was a calm and seemingly friendly departure from corporate life. I continued the same job as an illustrator, but now on my own terms, without strict schedules and pressure from management. Stephen continued to work at the Italian restaurant. His shifts were chaotic, sometimes stretching into the dead of night. I, busy with my projects at home, became more and more immersed in my work, although it became more difficult every day. But after all, I've always dreamed of being a freelancer, working at my own pace and creating without restrictions. An inner voice told me that it was the right decision. "That's a great idea, Olivia," Stephen said when I shared my doubts with him. "It will be easier for you. And most importantly, you will continue to do what you love." His support at that moment became my mainstay. We had just started our life as newlyweds, and everything seemed so right. We were two against the world, without unnecessary show-off and theatrical ceremonies. We liked simplicity. Therefore, when we decided not to arrange a wedding ceremony, but simply to sign at the registry office, it seemed the most natural option. We briefly got to know each other's families, exchanged formal greetings, and that was it. No fireworks or festive feasts. Stephen went to work immediately after registration, and I returned home, went about my usual business, thinking about how life had changed, but at the same time remained the same. Our days were shaping up into an orderly, albeit irregular, rhythm. He returned from work late. I carried out orders at home and kept house at the same time. Despite this, we tried to keep in touch. We always found time to have dinner together, talk about the day. Life was simple and seemed to be happy. I thought, here it is, marriage. He can really be so calm, harmonious. We did not strive for something grandiose, and this was our little happiness. However, about a year after the wedding, something began to change. All this calm harmony began to crack at the seams. My family wants to come, is that okay? Stephen asked me one day. Of course, I replied that everything was fine. It even seemed to me that this was a good opportunity to get to know his family better. After all, I had only glimpsed them during all this time, and our acquaintance was superficial, no more than a few formal words. I thought it would be a good chance to strengthen the bond with them. After I lost my parents as a child, I was always drawn to big families. And Stephen's family seemed to be just that, numerous and friendly. However, when his family finally arrived, my expectations were shattered. I was stunned. As soon as they crossed the threshold of our house, everything did not go as I imagined. Stephen's sister, who was 35 years old, she was 3 years older than both of us, literally from the doorstep, ignoring the formalities, asked, "Hey, which room is mine?" Her words sounded like an order, not a request. She worked at the local supermarket, and her manners were very different from the polite woman I met when I first met. The rudeness and impatience in her voice shocked me. It wasn't what I expected from a family visit. Stephen's younger sister, who was only 22 years old, came in behind her. She stood silently, without saying a word, as if lost in space. Her shyness reminded me of the same cold detachment with which she greeted me when we first met. She hardly spoke then, and the situation has not changed now. Stephen's older sister hurried her along, as if she were a shadow that just needed to be guided along the route. I tried to remain a hospitable hostess. Trying to hide my confusion, I showed the sisters the guest room where they could stay. I escorted Stephen's parents to a room that had once belonged to my parents. It was the only Japanese-style room in our apartment, and it seemed to me that they would be most comfortable there. I tried to imagine how they would get comfortable, and hoped that this visit would go smoothly. However, there was a growing sense of anxiety inside me that everything could go wrong. Stephen's sister smugly announced, "Since we're going to live here together, you better start serving our family properly." These words were uttered with such confidence that for a moment my breath caught in my throat. I didn't understand what she meant, and I tried to find Stephen's support, but he just laughed, in a way I'd never seen him laugh before. There was a kind of mockery in that laugh that was alien to me, as if the whole situation seemed comical to him, and my worries were petty and unfounded. It turned out that his family really gave up their own house and moved to my apartment without any warning or apology. Stephen did not see anything strange in this, explaining that they were forced to move out because their house could no longer be their home, and they had no other choice. "I wish you had told me about this earlier," I tried to express my displeasure, trying not to bring it to conflict. But Stephen, lowering his eyes, only gently apologized, "Please, this is temporary until they find a place for themselves. I'm begging you." His request sounded so sincere that I couldn't refuse. How can you refuse people, especially the family of someone who is so important to you, when they have no other choice? Reluctantly, I agreed to a temporary cohabitation, confident that it would not last long. However, as it turned out, it was one of those decisions that I soon regretted. From the very moment they moved into the apartment, problems began. Stephen's family, without showing the slightest restraint, completely shifted all household responsibilities to me. Their attitude was frankly consumerist. They didn't value my work, my efforts to maintain order. All four of them just sat idly by, doing absolutely nothing that could help. Each of them did and said whatever they wanted, not caring how it would affect me or our house. But most of all, I was struck by their complete indifference to finding a new home or job. When I dared to ask how their employment was going, Stephen's older sister gave me an annoyed look and said, "Oh, I quit that lousy job at the supermarket." I was stunned. I thought she was working full-time, and her sudden dismissal came as a shock to me. It turned out that her job was only temporary, and since she graduated from high school, she has never held on to a permanent place. Stephen's parents also found themselves out of work. They left their last part-time jobs before coming to us. Stephen's younger sister said she was supposedly studying, but as it turned out, it was just an appearance. I was at a loss. How could they be so carefree? When I tried to find out why none of them were trying to find a job, Stephen's younger sister, with obvious mockery in her voice, said, "Why should I work? I'm part of a rich family now." These words hit me like a blow. "Which rich family are you talking about?" I asked, and her answer stunned me. "About you, of course. You've received a lot of compensation and insurance after your parents' accident. And you don't even have a mortgage on this apartment. You can live in peace and not work." She said it laughing, as if it was the most mundane fact. I felt my hands clenching into fists from impotence and anger. Barely able to restrain myself, I decided to complain to Stephen when he returned from work. However, instead of being supported, I was faced with his rage. He was yelling at me like he'd never yelled at me before. His voice was filled with anger. "Do you want to kick my family out on the street, Olivia? Everyone is tired of having to leave their home. Can't you bear it for a bit?" His words stunned me. I froze, unable to answer, too stunned by such a reaction. But after a moment, Stephen suddenly changed his tone. His voice became soft. "I'm sorry for shouting. I've had a hard day. Can you be a little more patient? They just need time to recover." Looking back, I realized that Stephen has always been able to manipulate situations, skillfully mixing kindness and sharpness. But I didn't realize it at the time. At that moment, it seemed to me that I had to be patient, that I was doing the right thing. And I agreed again. But patience soon turned into a real test for me. Stephen's family abused my kindness more and more. They treated me like a servant, demanded money for walks and entertainment, referring to the fact that without funds they could not look for work. It seemed to me that it was pointless to say anything, although I felt a growing tension inside me. However, over time, the frequency of their requests for money decreased. Perhaps Stephen did say something to his relatives, and it seemed as if the problem had resolved itself. Of course, no one thought to return the money that I had already given them. I tried to calm myself with the thought that the main thing is still peace and quiet in the house. But 2 months later, living in this strange state, I noticed something disturbing. One day, while sorting through my monthly bills, I discovered that my credit card bill had become unusually high. Maybe someone used the card illegally. A thought flashed through my mind, and I hurried to check my credit card statement. To my horror, all payments were made from the same card issued in my name, and included purchases of groceries, drinks, books, video games, and even expensive branded bags and clothes. Each transaction was marked with a number indicating one of the 6 credit cards issued in my name that Stephen's family used. The cards were issued without my knowledge, but they have already been actively used. I was shocked. These cards allowed them to stop asking me for cash. Now they could pay for their own needs, hiding behind the fact that it was supposedly a family expense. When I tried to discuss this with Stephen, his answer startled me. Chuckling slightly, he said, "Well, you complained that they didn't have any money, so what choice did I have? Now they can provide for themselves. You know who was with you when you were all alone. Really? You should be grateful for everything we've done for you." These words were uttered with such an arrogant tone, which I had never heard from Stephen before. Every phrase, every remark was jarring. He continued, escalating the situation more and more. "If you are grateful, then you should serve my family even more. Only then will I recognize you as part of the family. Until then, consider yourself on probation." These words struck me to the core. Probation period? I repeated to myself, unable to believe what I was hearing. I've never heard of a marriage before where one of the spouses would be on probation. Seeing my silence, Stephen just grinned and added, "It means that you are not fully in the family yet. If you don't like it, you can always leave. We can do without you." His tone was so indifferent that my legs gave way. Something inside me turned over when I realized who Stephen really was. He was no longer the person I loved and considered my life partner. His words made me feel like all my blood had drained out of my body, leaving only a void. I stood in shock, thinking about divorcing him as the only way out of this nightmare. In fact, I was already beginning to wonder why I married Stephen in the first place. What attracted me to him? When I recalled our first meetings, it was difficult to find the true reasons. It seemed to me that then I just fell for his handsome appearance. He was a good-looking guy, and like many other girls, I was probably fascinated by his charm. But now it all seemed so shallow, so meaningless. At some point, I realized that I had never really known Stephen. Perhaps he used me for his own purposes from the very beginning. I remembered one moment that seemed especially significant to me now. It was not long after we had just started communicating. We were sitting at a table in one of the local cafes, and our mutual friend, joking, said, "Oh, you're probably the richest girl in town, living alone in such a gorgeous apartment." At the time, it seemed to me that it was just a harmless joke, but now I began to think differently. Perhaps it was then that Stephen first became interested in me not as a person, but as an opportunity to enrich himself. I've always liked mature men, those who spoke quietly and seriously, with wisdom and dignity. But somehow I fell in love with Stephen, and it always seemed strange to me. He was a typical handsome guy whose looks and charm seemed to make him invincible in winning the attention of women. And it must have been easy for him to charm people like me, inexperienced, new to the big world of adults. I was new to the labor field, not used to the attention of men. Stephen knew how to use his looks and manners. I fell for his cunning tricks, blinded by the illusion of a perfect relationship. And I ended up marrying him. This thought bothered me, caused disappointment, embarrassment, and even anger. I wanted to destroy everything, smash it to pieces, take out this unbearable frustration that was building up inside me. But I wasn't stupid enough to give in to those impulses. Instead, I decided to take revenge. And to do that, I needed to stay in this life a little longer by working out my own plan. Stephen had skillfully manipulated me, and now I was going to take control not only of him, but of his entire family. The apartment we lived in was bought by my father in my childhood. He took out a mortgage shortly after I was born. Back then it was just a comfortable apartment in an ordinary neighborhood, but the area began to develop rapidly. Over time, a new shopping center appeared here, and now the apartment was considered elite real estate, worth a lot of money. My parents hoped that they would have more children, so they bought a spacious apartment with plenty of space. Even with Stephen's family living in it now, it didn't seem cramped, but their presence was unbearable to me. Working from home, I felt especially overwhelmed by this constant pressure and intrusion into my personal space. But I continued to endure for the sake of my idea. Stephen's sister once remarked that my apartment was mortgage-free, as if that gave them the right to something more. They didn't know that when I was 4 years old, my parents died in a car accident. It happened on the very day they were returning from the funeral of their paternal grandfather. The car they were traveling in collided with another one on the highway. I could have been in that car with them, but I had a high fever because of the flu, so Grandma and Grandpa stayed with me. They saved me from death, but left me the lonely heiress of an apartment for which there were no more debts due to insurance payments on a group loan. All I had to pay for now were utilities and property taxes. When Stephen found out about the amount, He immediately offered to contribute a little more to our total expenses so that it would look fair. There is no mortgage, so I will put my share in, and you will use your income for personal expenses. Sounds fair, doesn't it? He was saying. At that time, blinded by love, I nodded, thinking that this would help me ease my financial burden. But looking back, I realize how stupid I was. Falling in love blinded me, and I didn't notice the obvious. Stephen considered himself the head of the family, the one who provides for us, but the truth was completely different. I paid for most of the expenses, utilities, food, entertainment. And now, among other things, 5 real parasites have settled in my house, who completely relied on my generosity. It seemed that the money I allocated was not enough for them, and they became more and more arrogant, taking advantage of my trust. I endured it with clenched teeth, just so that one day I could regain control. Their every action, every purchase, and every evening when they returned with new things, only added fuel to the fire. I reminded myself that eventually, when the time came, I would be the last to laugh. And so, 5 months after I decided to file for divorce, the day came when I decided to act. I was tired. Mentally, physically, emotionally. It's either me or your family, I said to Stephen, throwing him this ultimatum. None of Stephen's family lifted a finger to help around the house. They took my attempts to put things in order and organize their lives as a matter of course, as if it was my duty and not a common cause. All their worries, affairs, and problems fell on my shoulders, while I worked from home, trying to maintain a balance between professional activity and life among these people. I didn't just sit in front of a computer screen for entertainment. I worked, earned money, and solved important tasks. But they probably thought that I was a freeloader, that I should know my place, because in their opinion, Stephen was the one who supported me. At some point, I couldn't stand it and, choking with tears, expressed all this to Stephen. He greeted me with a grin, the same cold, contemptuous smile that nullified all my hopes for mutual understanding. Then you should leave, he said calmly, as if this was all a settled matter for him a long time ago. Didn't I tell you before? You're not really part of this family. You've never earned your place among us. These words seemed to be reflected in every corner of my mind, leaving behind a ringing silence. The shock and pain of his revelations permeated me, and I stared at Stephen, frozen, not believing what was happening. He continued, "If you can't live with my family, then you'll have to leave. And yes, since I had nothing to do with it, I will take this apartment and half of your savings as part of the property division." At that moment, the whole picture formed into a single holistic picture. This was his plan from the very beginning, to manipulate, use, and then take away my possessions as soon as I could no longer bear the presence of his family. The words that I had once taken for a manifestation of love now seemed like a lie, a trap set specifically to force me out of my own life. I knew that he and his family were trying to wear me down, but to hear it so openly was a painful blow. In front of me stood the man I once loved, the man with whom I had linked my life, but now in front of me stood a completely different Stephen, alien and cold. This meeting, oddly enough, helped me to make a final decision. "Okay," I said, gathering my courage, "I've decided to divorce you, Stephen. But this apartment belongs to me, and you know it." He clearly did not expect such a harsh response. I usually agreed with him, obeyed his decisions, and gave in. But now everything has changed. The reason for the divorce is that you let your family live with us without asking me, and they ignored me as the mistress of the house, I said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. Stephen's expression was one of surprise, perhaps even mild shock. He was not ready for such a turn. I got up, walked confidently to the door and added, "I'm not going to waste a single extra second on you. But you have to be ready to leave this house too." Stephen, who was usually in control of the situation, lost control at that moment. He screamed, "This is a joke, right? This is our home, we will not leave." Don't you know that we have residency rights? You can't just kick out the people who live here. But I've already stopped listening to him. I left the apartment without looking back and went to my grandparents'. I needed to recuperate, review my whole life, and get support from those who really cared about me. When I told them about everything I had been through, their reaction was sharp and lightning fast. Grandma threw up her hands and started scolding me for not addressing them earlier. Grandpa was also upset and asked how I could tolerate such an attitude for so long. With tears in my eyes, I asked for forgiveness. I'm sorry that I didn't come to you sooner. But now I know that everything will be fine. My eyes were glistening with tears, but I felt stronger than ever before. I may look fragile, but I'm not exactly like that, I added, forcing a laugh through my tears. The next day, after I left the apartment, Stephen contacted me almost instantly. Hey, what's all this about? He sounded annoyed, but at the same time confused. I was amazed by his speed. It seemed that he had managed to do all this drama in just one evening. But I knew he didn't expect me to file for divorce so quickly. I've referred the divorce proceedings to a lawyer, I replied calmly. What do you mean, the cards don't work? Stephen's voice on the other end of the line sounded puzzled at first, and then with a hint of panic. He did not immediately realize that I had already taken all necessary measures to cut off their access to my resources. What did you do? There was displeasure in his tone, almost indignation. What did I do? I asked, feeling a strange, even relieved satisfaction that I now had all the cards in my hands, literally and figuratively. I just canceled the family card you used. Do you remember how it was originally linked to my account? Before I left the apartment, I transferred all contracts and subscriptions to another card and canceled this one. Of course, your card will stop working. After all, only I have been paying for all this time. I deliberately paused, enjoying the way his confusion turned into impotence. Stephen started to say something again, but I continued, yes, you paid a small amount for the first 4 months for utilities and property taxes. It's not much, and if you want, I can deduct it from alimony. I grinned with those words. There were indistinct shouts on the other end of the line, as if he was trying to object, but realized that there was nothing to object with. The facts were on my side. Yes, Stephen did pay for the first 4 months, but then his promises became empty. He constantly found excuses, came up with reasons to postpone payments, either some large bill for purchases or accidental expenses. But in the end, he just stopped paying at all. Perhaps he himself forgot about his obligations, believing that they were still valid. However, this was his forgetfulness, not mine. I have already mentally released all his promises, along with the memories of our marriage. I kept detailed records of all our household expenses, I said with icy detachment. And now I will use these records as evidence to divide our savings fairly. Didn't you demand a fair division? Fine, let's divide everything as it should be. Yes, I agree. His voice sounded irritated. He was clearly hoping for a softer position on my part. However, a few days later he called again. What do you mean by family property being zero? A displeased tone filtered through the phone's speakers. You get money from your parents' insurance payments, from alimony. Why are you hiding this from me? Here it is, the true face of his plans. It seemed to him that my inheritance money and insurance also belonged to both of us. He and his family were clearly convinced that I had to share with them. But I patiently explained, my savings received before marriage are not part of the common property. We haven't accumulated anything during our marriage, so there's nothing to share. Stephen couldn't contain his displeasure. Don't lie to me. If you think that's a lie, why don't you consult a lawyer? His attempts to change my mind seemed increasingly desperate. If you don't believe me, then contact your lawyer. And from now on, please discuss all issues through my lawyer. I don't intend to communicate with you directly anymore. My composure was unshakable, and I ended the conversation by hanging up. Now everything was in the hands of the lawyers, and I would no longer let him drag me into pointless arguments. It's been a month since I left the apartment. Stephen and his family were forced to move out after all. And not at all because they suddenly realized that I was right, but simply because they could no longer maintain their usual lifestyle. Stephen's income was not enough to support a family of 5, who were used to living in a big way at the expense of my card. Now that I have blocked their access to money, it has become impossible to save money. They always believed that they could just take it without thinking about the consequences. But these consequences caught up with them as quickly as the disabled cards. I knew this was going to happen. I let them use the card intentionally, knowing full well that their extravagance would one day turn against them. And now that time has come. Stephen's family began to pester him, demanding money for purchases. When he refused, they started stealing from his wallet. Even when he got angry, they didn't admit their guilt. On the contrary, they accused him of kicking me out and putting everyone at risk. To top it all off, electricity, gas and water were turned off in the apartment. Of course, I organized it. I wasn't planning on returning to this house anytime soon, and I wasn't going to pay for their comfort. Now they were forced to face a reality that I had learned to cope with a long time ago. Stephen made an attempt to immediately restore public services, hoping to resolve all issues over the phone, as he had done before, confident in his rightness and influence. But everything turned out differently. The apartment was registered in my name, and therefore no one but me could initiate a reconnection. It wasn't just a formal question, it was control that I finally got back into my own hands. In the hot summer and early autumn, his family found themselves in unbearable conditions, unprepared for the harsh reality. In the absence of electricity and water, the house became literally uninhabitable. The intense heat only aggravated their situation, forcing them to retreat from an uncomfortable life to which they were unaccustomed. They eventually left the apartment. I don't know where they went, and I'm not interested. I no longer had the desire or the time to deal with their fate. Stephen tried to hold out to the last, proudly defending his presence in the house. But reality took its toll. Without electricity, without even being able to take a shower, he eventually gave up. The divorce procedure was completed faster than I expected. And not because Stephen suddenly changed his mind or made a wise decision, but because his careless actions played against him. As it turned out, he cheated on me even before the marriage broke up. Or rather, he started acting even when he was sure that he would soon get rid of me and take a step towards a new life. He was so sure of his impunity that he did not hide his intentions. He boasted that he had a luxury apartment in the city center, where he arranged meetings with young girls, luring them with luxury and imaginary success. One thing surprised me: how can you lead such a life when your family lives around you? But, apparently, this was the case when history repeats itself, and his family had long been accustomed to such behavior, not considering it something reprehensible. They turned a blind eye to all this, because they lived on his means, and their moral principles left much to be desired. But Stephen underestimated me. During all this time, he perceived me as a weak and submissive wife who would always make concessions and accept his demands. Before I left the house, I installed cameras in key locations. Everything was recorded: his infidelities, his lies, his attempts to make me a victim. These were my proofs, and now I had enough to ruin all his plans. Stephen thought I would accept it. But when I presented him with all the facts, from his infidelities to financial fraud with the family card, he realized for the first time how deeply he was mired in his own mistakes. I demanded huge alimony and compensation for everything he had done. When his lawyers saw the amount, Stephen literally turned pale. He desperately began to beg for reconciliation, for us to start all over again. But I couldn't and didn't want to do it anymore. How can you go back to someone who cheated on you, humiliated you, and tried to turn your life into a helpless existence? Knowing that Stephen did not have the opportunity to pay the entire amount at once, I forced him to take on loans, forcing him to borrow money from his company. I knew he would try to get out of it, but the threat of a lawsuit for card fraud forced him to sign everything I demanded. He was cornered, and I took everything I could get. The divorce process has been completed. Now I had legal confirmation that it was over. I stay with my grandparents, and although it was a temporary step, I felt safer than I had for a long time. All this time they were there for me, they supported me, and thanks to them I began to regain my strength. I haven't decided what to do with the apartment yet. She meant a lot to me. It was an inheritance from my parents, their last gift to me, but they left when I was too young to remember them. I have no memories of them, just this apartment. Now, after all that has happened, I think they would understand if I decided to let this place go. Sometimes the past needs to be let go in order to step into the future. My work is finally gaining momentum. I have long dreamed of becoming a successful illustrator, and now I have the opportunity to focus on my work. Maybe I'll live alone again, and it doesn't scare me. On the contrary, I feel that now is the moment for a new chapter in my life. I need a little more time to recover. I will continue to live with my grandparents until I feel strong enough to move on. But now I know one thing: no one will deceive me anymore. I won't let a man, even a handsome one, control my life. Next time, if I decide on a relationship, it will be a partner with whom I can share my life on equal terms.